On what should have been a routine bus ride, a father's cruel mockery of his own daughter grew louder with each passing stop, his alcohol-laced breath spreading bitter insults about her disability. While other passengers avoided confrontation by looking away, they failed to notice the Navy SEAL sitting right behind them, ready to take action. The dead air of the hospital therapy room hung on the faces of those gathered within. 14-year-old Emily Larson sat quietly next to her father, James, as they concluded their session with Dr. Catherine, the physical therapist, and Dr. Simon, the pediatric orthopedic specialist. Emily's left forearm, missing from birth due to amniotic band syndrome, rested on her lap, a constant reminder of the challenges she faced daily. James cleared his throat, his voice tinged with a mixture of exhaustion and frustration. "How much longer does this need to go on? We've been coming here for years now." Dr. Catherine exchanged a glance with Dr. Simon before responding. "Mr. Larson, I understand your concern, but we can't give you an exact timeline. Emily's progress is continuous, and her needs evolve as she grows." "But she's been making progress, right?" James pressed, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest of his chair. Dr. Catherine nodded, her voice taking on an encouraging tone. "Absolutely. Emily's fine motor skills have shown remarkable improvement. Just last week she managed to tie her shoelaces using the one-handed technique we've been practicing." Emily's face brightened slightly at the praise, but her father's expression remained tense. Dr. Simon leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "It's crucial to understand that without proper therapy, Emily's body would develop compensatory movements. These could lead to strain on her shoulders, spine, and other joints. The therapy we're doing now isn't just about immediate improvements, it's about long-term health and functionality." James nodded slowly, though his furrowed brow betrayed his lingering doubts. Dr. Simon continued, his tone cautious but optimistic. "There's also the possibility of prosthetics to consider. The work we're doing now would greatly benefit Emily if we decide to pursue that route in the future." Emily's eyes widened at the mention of prosthetics, a mixture of hope and uncertainty crossing her face. "A prosthetic arm could help with balance and mobility," Dr. Simon explained. "Of course, adapting to it would require additional therapy sessions. We'd need to build strength and coordination in Emily's residual limb, as well as work on overall balance, since the prosthetic would alter her natural posture and movement patterns." James's face paled slightly. "And how much would something like that cost?" Dr. Simon hesitated before answering. "The prosthetic itself would be around $10,000, and that's not typically fully covered by insurance. There would be additional costs for future adjustments and fittings as Emily grows." The color drained from James's face, though he struggled to maintain his composure. Emily noticed her father's distress, her shoulders slumping as she felt the familiar weight of being a burden settle upon her. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Catherine offered some final words of encouragement. "Think of this therapy as an investment. As Emily's fine and gross motor skills develop, and especially if she gets a prosthetic in the future, she'll be able to perform activities like cooking, writing, or even sports. It's about giving her the tools for a fuller life and reducing her reliance on others for basic tasks." James nodded stiffly, mumbling a quick thank you as he ushered Emily out of the room. His forced politeness barely masked the frustration simmering beneath the surface. Emily remained silent, already anticipating the shift in her father's mood that was sure to come. As they walked down the sterile hospital corridor, Emily couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. The possibility of a prosthetic arm filled her with a cautious hope, but the reality of their financial situation and her father's reaction weighed heavily on her young shoulders. She glanced up at James, noticing the tight set of his jaw and the worry lines etched deeply around his eyes. The familiar guilt of being the cause of his stress gnawed at her insides. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital gave way to the natural glow of the afternoon sun as Emily and James made their way to the cashier's desk. The sterile smell of disinfectant lingered in the air, a constant reminder of where they were and why. Emily watched her father's face carefully, noting the tightness around his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for his wallet. James reluctantly pulled out his card, the plastic seeming to weigh a ton in his grip. He stared at the amount displayed on the screen, shaking his head slightly as if in disbelief. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, smiled politely, oblivious to the storm brewing within James. "That'll be $150 for today's session, Mr. Larson," she said, her voice carrying the practiced cheerfulness of someone who had delivered this news countless times before. James nodded stiffly, inserting his card into the machine. As he waited for the transaction to process, his eyes darted around the room, taking in the other patients and their families. Some looked worried, others relieved, but all seemed to carry the weight of medical concerns on their shoulders. The machine beeped, signaling the completion of the payment. James quickly pocketed his card and receipt, muttering a barely audible thank you to the cashier. Emily could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched as they walked away from the desk. As they exited the hospital doors, the warm air hit them like a wall. Emily blinked, her eyes adjusting to the brightness after the dimmer interior of the hospital. She watched as her father reached into his jacket, pulling out what appeared to be a simple water bottle. But Emily knew better. James unscrewed the cap, his movements quick and practiced. He glanced around furtively before taking several long swigs from the bottle. Emily recognized the familiar grimace that crossed his face, not the refreshed look of someone drinking water, but the pained expression of someone choking down vodka. The effect was almost immediate. As they began walking towards the bus station, Emily noticed a slight sway in her father's step. His face, which had been tense and drawn inside the hospital, now took on a looser, more volatile expression. "Useless," James muttered under his breath, his words slightly slurred. "All of it. Useless." Emily kept her eyes fixed on the sidewalk ahead, pretending not to hear. She'd learned long ago that engaging with her father when he was like this only made things worse. "You know how much money we've spent on this?" James's voice grew louder, drawing uncomfortable glances from passers-by. "Years of therapy, and for what? So you can tie your shoes?" Emily felt her cheeks burn with shame. She wanted to remind him of all the progress she'd made, of how much easier everyday tasks had become. But she knew it wouldn't make a difference, not when he was like this. "I haven't found a job in months," James continued, his words becoming more bitter with each step. "Our savings are disappearing, and it's all going to this. He waved his hand vaguely in the direction of the hospital. A young couple walking by quickened their pace, throwing concerned glances in their direction. Emily wished she could disappear, melt into the pavement and away from her father's increasingly loud tirade. "I should never have married your mother," James spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Look what it's gotten me, a useless daughter and a mountain of debt." Each word cut into Emily like a knife, but she maintained her silence. Years of similar outbursts had taught her to weather these storms without reaction. She kept pace with her father, her mind already racing ahead to the bus station, hoping that somehow the presence of others might temper his mood. As they approached the bus stop, Emily's stomach churned with a mixture of dread and resignation. She knew the journey home would be long, and her father's mood was unlikely to improve. All she could do was endure, counting down the minutes until she could retreat to the relative safety of her room. The afternoon sun beat down on them relentlessly, as if nature itself was conspiring to make this moment as uncomfortable as possible. Emily wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead, stealing a glance at her father. His face was flushed, a combination of the alcohol and the heat, and his eyes had taken on that unfocused, dangerous look she knew all too well. As they waited for the bus, Emily silently prayed for strength. She knew the day was far from over, and the worst was likely yet to come. The bus stop outside the hospital parking lot was a stark contrast to the sterile environment they had just left. A single metal bench, its paint peeling under the relentless afternoon sun, stood as the only respite for weary travelers. Emily and James arrived at the stop, both glistening with sweat from the short walk in the oppressive heat. James immediately slumped onto the bench, pulling out his water bottle once more. Emily stood a few feet away, her eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for any sign of the approaching bus. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional gulp as James continued to drink. "You know," James slurred, his words becoming increasingly difficult to understand, "we could save so much money if we just stopped all this nonsense." Emily remained silent, having learned long ago that engaging only made things worse. "I said," James repeated, his voice rising, "we could save money if we stopped your therapy. Are you listening to me?" Before Emily could respond, a new figure approached the bus stop. A man in a crisp white Navy SEAL uniform walked up, nodding politely to both of them as he took his place a respectful distance away. Despite his attempt at discretion, it was impossible not to overhear James's continued berating. "You can forget about that fancy arm the doctor mentioned," James sneered, gesturing wildly with his bottle. "Might as well toss that dream into the deepest sea because there's no chance I'm paying for it, you hear me? Never dream about it, forget everything that quack said." Emily's eyes burned with unshed tears, but she blinked them back, determined not to show weakness in public. "It's time to stop the therapy too," James continued, his voice growing louder. "They're just after our money. We've been going for years, and that Catherine woman said your fine motor skills are pretty good now. That should be enough. You're 14, for Christ's sake. It's time to stop." "But Dad," Emily began, her voice barely above a whisper. James cut her off immediately. "I'm your elder and you're just a child. It's my money, my savings you're using, so shut up. I decide what to do with it." The Navy SEAL shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between maintaining professional distance and intervening in what was becoming an increasingly volatile situation. Suddenly, James stood up, swaying slightly. "I need more," he mumbled, gesturing with his nearly empty bottle. "You," he pointed at Emily, "make the bus wait if it comes. I'll be right back." As James stumbled away towards a nearby convenience store, Emily felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She glanced at the Navy SEAL, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. The man in uniform took a tentative step closer. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. Emily's initial response was one of defensive fear. "I'm fine," she said quickly, her eyes darting to where her father had disappeared. The Navy SEAL nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said gently. "I'm Lieutenant Andrew Hayes. I just want to make sure you're safe." Emily's shoulders slumped slightly. She held up her residual limb, a silent explanation for the situation. "I'm Emily Larson. That's my dad. We just came from therapy at the hospital," she said softly. Lit Hayes nodded, his expression a mixture of sympathy and concern. "I'm sorry you're going through this," he said. After a moment of silence, he added, "I'm taking Route 53 to the Oak Ridge Community Center. What about you?" Emily looked down, not meeting his eyes. "We're on the same bus," she murmured. Before their conversation could continue, James reappeared, his gait even more unsteady than before. His eyes narrowed as he saw Emily talking to the Navy SEAL. "What did I tell you about talking to strangers?" he snarled, grabbing Emily's arm roughly. Turning to Lieutenant Hayes, he spat, "Just because you're in a uniform doesn't mean you can talk to anyone's kid. These days, people can steal or make their own uniforms to pretend." Lit Hayes raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I apologize, sir. I didn't mean any harm." James pulled Emily away, positioning himself between her and the Navy SEAL. "I don't care if you're a real lieutenant or just someone playing dress-up. Don't talk to my daughter." The tension at the bus stop was palpable as they all stood in uncomfortable silence, waiting for the bus to arrive. Emily's mind raced, torn between embarrassment at her father's behavior and a glimmer of hope that someone had noticed their situation. As the sound of an approaching engine grew louder, she steeled herself for the journey ahead, knowing that the worst was likely yet to come. The bus pulled up to the stop with a hiss of hydraulics, its doors creaking open to reveal a tired-looking driver. Lieutenant Andrew Hayes boarded first, nodding politely to the driver as he made his way down the aisle. Emily followed, her steps hesitant, with James stumbling behind her. As soon as they were on board, James's demeanor shifted from sullen to confrontational. He lurched towards the driver, his words slurring together. "About damn time you showed up. Do you know how long we've been waiting?" The driver, a middle-aged man with deep lines etched into his face, sighed heavily. "Sir, we're on schedule. Please find a seat or exit the bus." James opened his mouth to argue further, but Emily tugged gently on his sleeve, silently pleading with him to move on. With a final glare at the driver, James allowed himself to be led towards the back of the bus. Andrew, who had chosen a seat several rows behind, couldn't help but think that if the bus had truly been on time, James might not have made it back from his alcohol run. The irony wasn't lost on him as he watched Emily guide her father to a seat, her face a mask of quiet shame. The bus was eerily empty for a Wednesday afternoon. The silence amplified every sound. James's muttered complaints, the hum of the engine, the squeak of seats as the few passengers shifted uncomfortably. At the next stop, a young woman boarded, struggling slightly with a baby in a pram. She made her way to the disabled seating area near the front, settling in with a sigh of relief. The presence of the infant seemed to shift the atmosphere on the bus. Emily's attention was drawn to the baby, a wistful expression crossing her face. James, too, focused on the new arrivals. He stood unsteadily, leaning forward to peer at the baby. "What a cute, perfect little thing," he said, his voice carrying loudly in the quiet bus. The woman smiled nervously, clearly noticing James's unfocused eyes and the beer bottle poorly concealed in his hand. "Thank you," she said softly, turning her attention back to her cooing infant. James chuckled, a bitter edge to his laughter. "My daughter was cute and perfect when she was that small," he said, gesturing vaguely towards Emily. "Now she's a teenager, and well, things change." The woman nodded politely, not engaging further. She busied herself with adjusting her baby's blanket, pointedly avoiding James's gaze. "I bet you'll love that baby even when she grows up," James continued, his voice growing louder. "Yeah, I'd love mine too if she was perfect like yours." Emily sank lower in her seat, wishing she could disappear. She could feel the eyes of the woman and the lieutenant on her, a mixture of pity and discomfort evident in their glances. Lieutenant Hayes watched the scene unfold, his jaw clenched tight. He wanted to intervene, to say something to defuse the situation, but he knew that any action on his part might only escalate things further. Instead, he kept a watchful eye on Emily, ready to step in if James's behavior became truly dangerous. The bus continued its journey, the tension inside palpable. Emily stared out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by, each turn bringing them closer to home. She found herself dreading their arrival, knowing that once they were behind closed doors, her father's mood was likely to worsen. As the bus rumbled on, Emily caught Lieutenant Hayes's eye in the reflection of the window. He gave her a small, reassuring nod, and for a moment she felt a flicker of hope. Someone had noticed. Someone cared. But as James's muttering grew louder once more, that flicker was quickly extinguished, replaced by the familiar weight of resignation. The journey stretched on, each minute feeling like an hour. Emily closed her eyes, silently willing the bus to move faster, to bring this ordeal to an end. But deep down she knew that even when they reached their stop, her troubles were far from over. The real challenge would begin once they were home, away from the watchful eyes of strangers, where James's anger could truly unleash itself. The bus had been traveling in relative quiet for some time, the tension from earlier seemingly dissipated. James had fallen into a brooding silence, occasionally taking swigs from his concealed bottle while staring out the window. Emily sat rigid beside him, her eyes fixed on the passing scenery, desperately wishing for the journey to end. Suddenly, without warning, the bus driver slammed on the brakes. The vehicle lurched forward, tires screeching against the asphalt as it came to an abrupt halt at the next station. The unexpected stop sent passengers jolting in their seats. Emily, caught off guard and struggling with her balance due to her missing limb, was thrown forward. In a desperate attempt to steady herself, she inadvertently bumped into James. The collision caused his beer bottle to slip from his grasp, its contents spilling across the floor, seat, and his lap. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The only sound was the soft dripping of beer onto the floor and the collective held breath of the passengers. Emily's heart raced as she watched the dark stains spread across her father's pants, knowing what was about to come. James's face contorted with rage, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face his daughter. The silence that had fallen over the bus was electric with tension, everyone waiting to see how this would unfold. "You clumsy, useless girl," James roared, his voice filling the confined space of the bus. "Can't you do anything right? All those years of therapy, and you still can't even keep your balance." Emily shrank back into her seat, flinching at her father's sharp words. But something inside her shifted, a dam of suppressed feelings breaking free. Her voice, trembling but resolute, cut through the tension. "Please, Dad," she said, her tone rising with each word. "If therapy just makes you hate me more, don't take me anymore. I won't go if it means this. If it makes you like this." Her plea hung in the air, shocking everyone, including James. His expression flickered from surprise to something that might have been guilt, though it vanished quickly, replaced by a dark scowl that sent a chill through Emily. "How dare you!" he bellowed, his hand lifting slightly in anger. Before he could act further, the baby's cries grew louder, piercing through the charged atmosphere. The sound seemed to halt James mid-motion, his hand dropping back to his side. The young mother with the pram, her face pale with alarm, stood abruptly. Her voice trembled as she called out to the driver, "Driver, please, I need to get off, I don't feel safe." The driver, his tone weary but firm, responded without turning around. "Ma'am, this is a bus, not a taxi. I can't just stop anywhere. You'll have to wait until the next stop." The baby's wails escalated, filling the confined space of the bus. James scowled, slamming his hand against the window frame. "That damn baby!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. The driver finally sighed, gripping the wheel tighter. All right," he muttered. He pulled the bus over to the curb, the brakes hissing loudly. "Get off if you need to." As the bus doors opened and the woman hurriedly exited with her baby, she caught Emily's eye. In that brief moment, a world of unspoken understanding passed between them. The woman's face was a mixture of sympathy and regret. Sorry for what she had witnessed, sorry that she couldn't do more to help, but ultimately needing to prioritize her own child's safety. Emily watched her leave, wishing she could escape just as easily. The tension that had been building throughout the bus ride erupted as the bus door shut behind them with a heavy thud. James turned back to Emily, his face a storm of anger and frustration. "You've got some nerve talking to me like that," he spat. She could see the muscles in his jaw working, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. James raised his hand, poised to strike Emily. The beer bottle, still clutched in his other hand, glinted menacingly in the fluorescent bus lighting. Emily instinctively squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact she knew was coming. Suddenly, a strong hand caught James's arm mid-swing. Andrew Hayes had moved with the swift efficiency of his military training, crossing the distance between them in mere seconds. His grip was firm, his stance commanding as he addressed James. "That's enough," Andrew said, his voice low but authoritative. "I've seen and heard more than enough to know you don't care about your daughter's well-being. I'm calling the police if you don't let go of that bottle." James's face contorted with rage as he struggled against Andrew's grip. "Let go of me, you bastard," he snarled. "This is a family matter. You have no right to interfere." Andrew's grip remained steady. "When it comes to the safety of a child, everyone has the right to interfere," he replied calmly. The bus driver, who had been watching the scene unfold through his rearview mirror, called out, "Do I need to stop the bus?" "Keep driving," Andrew responded, his eyes never leaving James. "We'll handle this." James's struggles became more frantic, his words slurring together as he shouted, "You can't stop me from disciplining my own daughter. She's useless, can't you see? All that money wasted on therapy, and for what?" Emily, who had been frozen in shock, finally found her voice. "Dad, please," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Just stop, please." But James was beyond reason. He lunged forward, trying to break free from Andrew's grip. "I'll have you arrested for assault," he threatened. "You think that uniform gives you the right to manhandle civilians?" Andrew remained calm in the face of James's tirade. "Sir, I'm not manhandling you. Now please sit down and calm yourself before this situation gets any worse." As the men continued their heated exchange, Emily's mind raced. Her father's earlier words about perfect children echoed in her head. She thought back to her earliest memories, trying to pinpoint when her father's love had turned to resentment. Had he always felt this way? Was there a time before the alcohol when he had truly loved her, disabilities and all? She remembered moments of tenderness from her early childhood, her father teaching her to tie her shoes with one hand, his proud smile when she learned to write. But those memories seemed to belong to a different lifetime, to a different man than the one who stood before her now. Rage and alcohol having twisted him into someone she barely recognized. The woman from earlier on the bus came to mind, her words about loving her baby even as it grew up. Emily's heart ached with the realization that her father's love had been conditional, dependent on her being perfect in his eyes. As the argument between James and Andrew escalated, Emily felt a surge of emotion welling up inside her. Years of pent-up frustration, fear and sadness threatened to overflow. She couldn't take it anymore. The fighting, the shame, the constant feeling of being a burden. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice ringing out through the bus. "Just stop, both of you!" Her outburst caught both men off guard. They turned to look at her, momentarily stunned into silence. Emily stood there, trembling but determined, her one hand clenched into a fist at her side. "I'm tired of this," she continued, her voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. "I'm tired of being the reason for all the fighting, for all the drinking. I never asked to be born like this. I never asked for all the therapy or the doctors or any of it. I just wanted a father who loved me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with years of unspoken pain. James's face cycled through a range of emotions, anger, confusion, and finally a flicker of something that might have been shame. Andrew's grip on James's arm loosened slightly, his expression softening as he looked at Emily. For a moment, it seemed as though Emily's words might have gotten through to her father. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, any hint of remorse vanished from James's face. His eyes hardened, his jaw set in a familiar stubborn line. "You ungrateful little—" His hand grasping her collar roughly. The beer bottle, still clutched in his other hand, was raised menacingly. "This is all your fault." Emily's eyes widened in terror, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the bottle poised to strike. In that moment, all the years of therapy, all the progress she had made in building her confidence, seemed to evaporate. She was once again a scared little girl, facing a monster she couldn't escape. Andrew Hayes reacted with lightning speed, his military training kicking in. In one fluid motion, he pulled Emily backwards, out of James's grasp, while simultaneously reaching for his phone. "That's it," Andrew said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I'm calling the police right now." As Andrew dialed, keeping himself between Emily and James, he spoke clearly into the phone. "Yes, I need police assistance immediately. We're on bus route 53, approaching the Oak Ridge Community Center stop. There's a domestic violence situation involving a minor." James, realizing the severity of the situation, made a desperate lunge towards Andrew. "Give me that phone," he shouted, swinging the beer bottle wildly. Andrew deftly avoided the attack, his reflexes honed by years of training. In a swift move, he disarmed James, securing the bottle and holding it out of reach. "Sir, I strongly advise you to calm down and step back," Andrew said, his voice firm but controlled. "The police are on their way. Don't make this situation any worse than it already is." Emily, now safely behind Andrew, felt a whirlwind of emotions. Relief at being protected, warred with fear of what would happen next. She could hear the approaching sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The bus pulled over to the roadside and lurched to a stop. The bus driver stood by the open door. As the wail of sirens grew closer, James seemed to deflate. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a look of desperation. He turned to Emily, his eyes pleading. "Emmy, baby," he said, his voice suddenly soft in whisper. "Tell them it was all a misunderstanding. Tell them Daddy loves you. You know I'd never really hurt you, right?" Emily felt her chest tighten at his words. How many times had she heard this before? How many promises of change, of doing better, had been broken? She wanted so badly to believe him, to have her loving father back. But the memory of the raised bottle, the years of verbal abuse and neglect were too fresh, too raw. Before she could respond, the screech of brakes announced the arrival of the police. Two officers quickly approached the bus, their cruiser's lights flashing in the late afternoon sun. "What's going on here?" the first officer asked, his eyes scanning the interior of the bus as he climbed in, his hand resting cautiously on his holster. Andrew stepped forward, his posture straight and professional despite the stress of the situation. "Officers, I'm Lieutenant Andrew Hayes, U.S. Navy. I witnessed this man," he gestured to James, verbally abusing his daughter throughout the bus ride. The situation escalated when he attempted to physically assault her. I intervened to protect the child. As Andrew gave his statement, Emily watched her father's face. She saw the moment when he realized the gravity of the situation, the fear that flashed in his eyes. For a brief instant, she saw past the monster of the past few hours to the broken man beneath, a man consumed by his own demons, drowning in alcohol and resentment. But then James's expression hardened once more. He straightened up, attempting to project an air of indignant innocence. "This is all a big misunderstanding," he said, his words still slightly slurred. "We were just having a family disagreement. This man," he pointed accusingly at Andrew, "had no right to interfere, and what he said is a lie." The officers looked between the two men, their expressions guarded as they assessed the conflicting stories. "Sir," one of the officers addressed the bus driver, "can you tell us what you saw?" The driver, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, shrugged. "Don't drag me into this. I'm just a driver, and I have a schedule to catch. I was paying attention to the road, so I don't fully understand what happened. There was no violence that I saw, just two men arguing." The officers then turned their attention to Emily, who had been silent throughout the exchange. "Miss, are you all right? Can you tell us what happened?" Emily felt all eyes on her, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. She glanced at her father, seeing the mixture of threat and pleading in his eyes. Then she looked at Andrew, remembering his kindness and intervention. In that moment, torn between fear and a desperate hope for change, Emily made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. It was just a misunderstanding," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The lieutenant thought he was helping, but my dad would never hurt me." James seized the opportunity, pulling Emily into an exaggerated display of affection. "See, officers, my daughter wouldn't lie. Just look at her arm." He gestured to Emily's residual limb. "There's no way I would hit her. I have always loved her, my gentle baby. She's such a nice person, even at this age." Andrew, disbelief evident on his face, tried one last time to intervene. "Officers, this man is clearly drunk. Surely you can tell just from the smell of his breath." When James started to protest, Emily quickly added, "Yes, my dad had a couple of beers, but he didn't hurt me." The officers exchanged glances, clearly frustrated by the conflicting accounts and lack of clear evidence. Finally, one of them spoke. "Mr. Hayes, I'm afraid without clear evidence or testimony, there's not much we can do here. Making false reports is a serious offense." The bus driver, eager to resume his route, called out, "Officers, is everything done here? I need to go and catch my schedule." The lead officer nodded. "Yes, you can continue your route." Turning to James and Emily, he added, "I suggest you two find alternative transportation home." As James triumphantly led Emily off the bus, he couldn't resist one last taunt. "That's what you get for getting into other people's business," he shouted at Andrew. The bus doors closed, leaving Andrew standing there, watching helplessly as Emily and James walked away. The last thing he saw before the bus pulled away was Emily's face, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret, as she mouthed a silent, "I'm sorry" to him. As the bus merged back into traffic, Andrew moved to the back, his mind racing with concern for Emily and frustration at his inability to help. He knew he couldn't just leave things as they were, but what could he do now? The memory of Emily's desperate apology haunted him, reminding him of his own painful past. He knew he had to find a way to help, no matter the cost. The bus rumbled down the street, leaving behind the scene of confrontation. Andrew sat in the back, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Disappointment warred with understanding as he replayed Emily's lies in his head. He knew all too well the reasons a child might protect an abusive parent: fear, misplaced loyalty, the desperate hope that things might change. Through the window, he caught a final glimpse of James and Emily. James was laughing, his voice carrying even over the engine noise, as he shouted one last taunt at the departing bus. His grip on Emily's arm looked painfully tight as he roughly steered her down the sidewalk. The bus driver called out, "Hey, Navy man, you gonna move up or what? Can't have you brooding back there all day." "You saw what happened in the bus, why didn't you speak up?" Andrew asked the driver, as he moved to a seat closer to the front. "Well, I've learned to mind my own business. You saw that man. There's no winning against someone like him, especially for someone in a position like mine. I'm just a bus driver, you know." As the familiar streets of the neighborhood passed by, Andrew found himself locked in an internal struggle. The rational part of his mind told him to let it go. He had done what he could, and interfering further could only lead to trouble. But another part of him, the part that still carried the scars of his own childhood, screamed that he couldn't abandon Emily to her fate. Memories of his own past flooded back, the sound of doors slamming, the smell of alcohol on his mother's breath, the feeling of helplessness as he tried to protect his little sister. He remembered the neighbors who had turned a blind eye, the teachers who had accepted flimsy excuses for bruises and absences. He remembered wishing, praying for someone, anyone, to step in and help. The bus was coming to the next stop, and Andrew realized with a start that they had reached his destination. The community center loomed before him, a reminder of the event he was supposed to attend. He had responsibilities, commitments. He couldn't just... But even as he thought it, he knew he had already made his decision. "Driver, I'll get off at the next stop," Andrew said firmly, "and I'll prove that a good fight can be won." The driver pulled at the next stop and the door flipped open. "Well, take care and good luck." As he stepped off the bus, Andrew's mind was already racing, formulating a plan. He knew the general direction James and Emily had been heading. If he moved quickly, he might be able to find their house. It was a long shot, but he had to try. Andrew set off at a brisk pace, retracing the bus route on foot. The neighborhood was quiet, rows of similar-looking houses lining the streets. He moved carefully, aware that his uniform made him highly visible. The last thing he wanted was to alert James to his presence before he could assess the situation. As he walked, Andrew wrestled with the potential consequences of his actions. He could lose his job, face legal trouble, or worse. But every time doubt crept in, he thought of Emily's face, the fear in her eyes, the silent plea for help that her words had denied. After about 10 minutes of searching, Andrew found himself in what he believed to be the right area, but all the houses looked so similar. How could he possibly... Suddenly a scream pierced the quiet afternoon air. Andrew's blood ran cold as he recognized Emily's voice. Without hesitation, he sprinted towards the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. He found himself in front of a modest 2-story house, its paint peeling and lawn overgrown. The screams had stopped, but now he could hear the sound of breaking glass from an upstairs window. Andrew approached the front door, his hand raised to knock. But before he could make contact, another crash from upstairs made him pause. He circled around to the backyard, where he witnessed frames being thrown from a second-floor window, shattering on the ground below. In that moment, Andrew knew he couldn't wait any longer. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his voice steady as he reported the domestic disturbance. As he waited for the police to arrive, he kept his eyes fixed on the house, ready to intervene if the situation escalated further. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, piercing the quiet suburban afternoon. Andrew stood in the backyard, his eyes fixed on the second-floor window where he had seen the frames being thrown. His heart raced, torn between the urge to rush in and help Emily immediately, and the knowledge that waiting for proper backup was the safest course of action. Suddenly, a voice behind him made Andrew's blood run cold. "What the hell are you doing here?" James slurred, his words thick with alcohol and rage. Andrew turned slowly, his military training kicking in as he assessed the situation. James stood unsteadily at the corner of the house, his face flushed and contorted with anger. In his hand, he clutched another beer bottle, knuckles white around its neck. "Mr. Larson," Andrew said calmly, raising his hands in a non-threatening gesture, I'm here to make sure Emily is safe, that's all. James's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint flashing in them. You just can't mind your own business, can you? He snarled. I told you, this is family matter. Get off my property before I call the cops on you for trespassing. Andrew turned slowly, his military training kicking in as he assessed the situation. James stood unsteadily at the corner of the house, his face flushed and contorted with anger. In his hand, he clutched another beer bottle, knuckles white around its neck. Mr. Larson, Andrew said calmly, raising his hands in a non-threatening gesture. I'm here to make sure Emily is safe, that's all. James's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint flashing in them. You just can't mind your own business, can you? He snarled. I told you, this is family matter. Get off my property before I call the cops. Sir, I understand you're upset, Andrew said, taking a cautious step forward, but I'm concerned for your daughter's well-being. Let's just wait for the police to arrive and sort this out calmly. James's face twisted into a sneer. You think that uniform gives you the right to interfere in my life, to tell me how to raise my kid? He took a menacing step towards Andrew. I'll show you what happens to nosy bastards who don't know their place. Before Andrew could react, James lunged forward, swinging the beer bottle wildly. Years of training took over as Andrew dodged the attack, but not quite fast enough. The bottle grazed his temple, sending a sharp pain through his head. At that moment, 2 police cruisers screeched to a halt in front of the house. Officers poured out, weapons drawn as they took in the scene. Police, freeze! One officer shouted, his gun trained on James. James, realizing he was cornered, dropped the bottle and raised his hands. But even as the officers moved to restrain him, he continued to shout threats and obscenities. This man is trespassing, James yelled, struggling against the officer's grip. He's been harassing my family. Arrest him! Andrew, holding a hand to his bleeding temple, addressed the officers calmly. I'm Lieutenant Andrew Hayes, U.S. Navy. I witnessed a domestic disturbance involving a minor and called it in. The girl Emily is still inside. She may need medical attention. One of the officers nodded, recognizing Andrew from the earlier bus incident. We'll check on the girl. Johnson, read him his rights and get him in the car, he said, gesturing to James. As James was led away, still shouting and struggling, Andrew turned his attention to the house. Officers, I'd like to accompany you inside if possible. Emily knows me and she might be more comfortable with a familiar face. The lead officer considered for a moment before nodding. All right, but stay behind us. They approached the house cautiously, the officer calling out, Emily, this is the police. We're coming in to make sure you're okay. As they entered, the signs of struggle were immediately apparent. Broken glass littered the floor, and picture frames lay shattered, their contents strewn about. Andrew followed the officers up the stairs, his heart pounding. They approached a closed door at the end of the hall, from behind which they could hear muffled sobs. The officer knocked gently. Emily, it's the police. We're here to help. Can you open the door? There was a moment of silence, then the sound of a lock turning. The door creaked open slowly, revealing Emily's tear-stained face. As the door opened fully, Emily's small frame came into view. Her eyes, red and puffy from crying, widened in surprise when she saw Andrew standing behind the officers. For a moment, she seemed frozen in place, her gaze darting between the uniformed men and the familiar face of the Navy SEAL who had tried to help her earlier. Emily, one of the officers said gently, crouching down to her eye level. We're here to make sure you're safe. Can you tell us what happened? Emily's lower lip trembled as she looked at the officer. Then, in a rush of words that seemed to surprise even her, she blurted out, Please don't arrest my dad. I can't do anything without him. I don't want to be an orphan. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and concern. Andrew felt his heart clench at the fear in Emily's voice. I'm already disabled, Emily continued, her words coming faster now, tinged with desperation. No one at school wants to be my friend. It would be even worse if they knew my father was in jail. Please, you can't take him away. Andrew stepped forward, his voice soft as he addressed Emily. I know you might feel out of place because of your condition, especially at your age, he said, choosing his words carefully. But what your father did was not right, Emily. It was dangerous. Emily's eyes locked onto Andrew's, a flicker of recognition passing between them. In that moment, Andrew made a decision. He knelt down beside the officer, bringing himself to Emily's level. "Emily," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I understand why you're scared. I know what it's like to feel different, to worry about what others might think. But I need you to listen to me, okay?" Emily nodded hesitantly, her eyes never leaving Andrew's face. "When I was young," Andrew continued, "I had a little sister. We grew up with an alcoholic mother. For years I tried to protect my sister, to keep our family together no matter what. But one night—" His voice caught, the pain of the memory still fresh after all these years. "One night my mother went too far. My sister was so young and she didn't survive." A collective gasp went through the room. Even the officers, hardened by years on the force, looked shaken by Andrew's revelation. "I'm telling you this," Andrew said, his eyes never leaving Emily's, "because I want you to understand how dangerous this situation is. Your father needs help, Emily, real help that you can't give him, and you need to be safe." Emily's lower lip trembled, tears welling up in her eyes once more. But he's my dad," she whispered. "He takes care of me. Who will help me with my therapy if he's gone?" Andrew reached out, gently placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "Emily, I promise you won't be alone in this. There are people who can help, social workers, counselors, maybe even relatives you don't know about yet. And if you'll let me, I'd like to help too." Emily looked at him, a mix of hope and uncertainty in her eyes. You would?" Andrew nodded firmly. "I know some people who work with military charities. We might be able to help with your therapy bills. And I have a friend who's a military doctor. He specializes in prosthetics. We could see about getting you fitted for one if that's something you're interested in." For the first time since they'd entered the room, a small smile tugged at the corners of Emily's mouth. "Really?" "Really," Andrew confirmed. "But first we need to make sure you're safe. Can you tell the officers what happened today? The whole truth this time?" Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded, slowly, haltingly at first, but then with increasing confidence she began to speak. She told them about the years of verbal abuse, the drinking, the constant fear. She explained about the therapy sessions, her father's resentment of the cost, and his threats to stop them altogether. As Emily spoke, Andrew felt a mixture of sadness and relief wash over him. Sadness for all this young girl had endured, but relief that she was finally speaking her truth, finally asking for the help she so desperately needed. When Emily finished her story, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the seasoned officers looked deeply moved by her account. "I'm sorry," Emily said suddenly, turning to Andrew. "I'm sorry I lied earlier on the bus. I was scared." Andrew shook his head, a gentle smile on his face. "You don't need to apologize, Emily, I understand. What matters is that you're telling the truth now. That's incredibly brave of you." As one of the officers began explaining the next steps to Emily, about giving a formal statement, about Child Protective Services, about what would happen to her father, Andrew stood up, his mind already racing with plans. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy for Emily. There would be challenges, setbacks, and difficult days. But as he watched her nod along to the officer's words, a new determination in her eyes, Andrew felt a surge of hope. This time he thought things would be different. This time a child's cry for help had been heard, and he was determined to make sure Emily got the support and care she needed to not just survive, but to thrive. The flashing lights of police cars cast an eerie blue glow across the suburban street as Emily stepped out of her house. She clutched a small backpack filled with essentials, her eyes darting nervously between the officers and the neighbors who had gathered to watch the commotion. In the distance, she could see her father being placed in the back of a police cruiser. Even from afar, she could hear his voice, a mixture of anger and desperation. "Emily," James called out, his words slurring. "Tell them it's all a mistake. I'll change, I promise. This time will be different." Emily felt her resolve waver for a moment. How many times had she heard those words? How many times had she wanted to believe them? but then she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder and looked up to see Andrew standing beside her. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're doing the right thing." Emily nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She turned to the officer beside her, a kind-faced woman who had introduced herself as Officer Martinez. "I'm ready," Emily said, her voice small but determined. As they walked towards the waiting car that would take Emily to give her statement at the station, Andrew fell into step beside them. "Emily," he said, "I know I mentioned the community event I was supposed to attend today, but if it's all right with you and Officer Martinez, I'd like to postpone that and accompany you to the station, only if you're comfortable with that, of course." Emily looked up at him, surprise and gratitude mixing in her expression. You'd do that? But won't you get in trouble for missing your event?" And Andrew shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. "Some things are more important. Besides, I think my commanding officer will understand once I explain the situation." Officer Martinez nodded her approval. Having a familiar face might help Emily feel more at ease during the process. If that's what you both want, I don't see a problem with it. As they settled into the car, Emily's mind raced with questions and fears about what lay ahead. As if sensing her unease, Andrew began to speak, his voice calm and reassuring. "I know this is scary, Emily," he said, "but I want you to know that you're not alone in this. Remember what I said about helping with your therapy and possibly getting you fitted for a prosthetic." Emily nodded, a flicker of hope lighting up her eyes. "Well, I meant every word," Andrew continued. "I've already reached out to some contacts. There's a charity that works with military families and children with disabilities. I believe they would be interested in hearing your story and might be able to help with the costs of your ongoing therapy." Emily's eyes widened. "Really? But why would they want to help me? I'm not from a military family." Andrew smiled gently. "Because your story is important, Emily, and because everyone deserves a chance to reach their full potential, regardless of their circumstances." As they drove, Andrew outlined more of his plans. He told Emily about the military doctor he knew, a specialist in pediatric prosthetics who was willing to consult on her case. He explained about support groups for children of alcoholics and counseling services that could help her process the trauma she'd experienced.